Um, sorry. Welcome to the second day here at FDLA. Want to take a few minutes to thank our sponsors. If you click on the sponsor link inside the program, you will see that we have 2 diamond sponsors, actually 3. UF has 2 different divisions that help and support us. And then the Central Florida University also is a diamond sponsor. And then we also have 2 bronze sponsors. One is Flow Ops, and oh my goodness, I forgot what the other one was. But we appreciate their support, because without them, we would not have enough money to support this conference. So thank you so much for that. And for those of you who are at other universities, our organizational sponsorship is amazing. You can pay for your conference sponsorships for your faculty for a lot less than if you paid for them individually. So we're very affordable, and I hope to see all of you next year. I'm going to start this presentation by introducing Dr. Pam Northrup. She is a great mentor to me. She has mentored me through my whole academic career since I started off in her degree program back when she was at UWF. And I really feel I'm so grateful. I don't know, I share this all the time for what UWF did for me, because I came in as a very gifted student, and they allowed me to create my own doc program, and which, so I could excel and become the great person, have the great positions that I have today. So I always want to make sure I express my gratitude to both Dr. Northrup and her team, and then also to UWF for allowing me to do that. I don't think I could have gone anywhere else, and they would have been as flexible about their degree programs. So Dr. Northrup has had a very, in my opinion, a great career. She was a department chair when I was there at UWF. Then she became the dean of the College of Education, and then she moved up into administration at that university, and ended up being vice provost, I believe, of creative or some innovative learning, or something along those
like that. Yeah.
And today she owns her own company and consults with both state and higher ed institutions, and giving them guidance on educational issues for their institutions or their organizations. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Northrup.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here today, and to get to see Vicki do so well in her career. It's always wonderful for a professor to see, students doing exceptionally well. So thank you, Vicki, for just carrying the torch and continuing to do great work. So I'm going to talk today. I was asked to speak a little bit about, we first started thinking about this, the conference was going to be a little bit earlier, right? Because we had that whole little hurricane thing going on in Florida. And so I was going to talk a little bit about the post-pandemic puzzle. We've got just a few more, several months more of knowledge and so forth at this point. So, but it doesn't mean it's post-pandemic, and I'm not really sure if you're supposed to say post-pandemic. I don't think anybody knows for sure, but I'm going to talk a little bit today, just starting at the beginning, tell a little bit of a story about it, and really leaning into those, just opportunities and issues and things that we experience as higher education, distance learning experts along the way. And then at this point in time, some real, some lessons that we've learned, and maybe lessons that we're still learning amidst the exhaustion and, fuzziness of how the future goes. Interesting that, as Vicki said, I do a lot of consulting. So I work all over the country, and I have an appointment with Louisiana Board of Regents and a couple of additional institutions as well. And people aren't really talking about the pandemic anymore. They're talking about the future. They're moving forward. They're trying to, do new strategic plans and figure out, almost like they're back to regular business, ... except that we're in a very different place than where we were prior to the pandemic. So that's kind of how today is going to go. Vicki, I think, do I have control here? Let's see. Oh, yeah.
I have control, I think.
Okay, can you go to the next slide?
I'm
I'm a
trying.
co-presenter. I should.
You're actually like probably the last person that should be doing this.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm going
Are you backwards?
backwards. Yes. Okay, let's go previous and previous. Okay.
Yeah. So this, this one is just a slide. I love the slide, but we are. So I'm going back to the day, almost like it was 100 years ago. It feels like at this point, but we all knew where we were, right? When we got the call that it was time to get everyone and go home. And I was working doing some consulting actually around in a couple of different countries at that time, and was getting to hear their perspective. I was working in South Africa, and I was also working in Brazil. And just, it was so interesting to hear what was happening there versus what was happening here, and just learning from them was actually pretty spectacular. But I got a call from an institution, and literally the president's one word to me was help. And because they had an institution outside of Florida. So in Florida, I feel like we have done such a great job through the years, just in building structure and form and online learning for each of our institutions, that obviously a lot of work to do, but there was a lot of foundation. At this particular institution, not so much. They only had a few faculty that were teaching online. They were using Moodle, but no one else was. They didn't have a lot of technology. And so I got in the car and went, and, along the way, things were already closing, right? You already couldn't go inside, and you couldn't get to this, and you couldn't get to that. And so it was beginning, and you certainly couldn't get toilet paper, because that was one of the very first issues. But went to that institution and just started having conversations with faculty. And, the thought that had we tried to do this without that global pandemic looming, right, we would have gotten a lot of fights. No, we can't do this. The quality is this, all these things we've heard, or I've heard for 25 years. Instead, faculty were asking the question like, well, how? I don't really know how to do this. So it was a completely different set of conversations than what it was in the past. And I'm sure you all experienced that as well. I spent a lot of time working with, variety of different kinds of faculty. Some, they were trying very hard to figure out how they could do their laboratories online. And I'm sure you dealt with this as well. And how to do choral performances online, how to do art online, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we just began having those conversations. So Vicki, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a lot more about those three areas in a bit. Okay, so throughout this presentation, I've got little story bits along the way, and because context is kind of small, I'm going to go ahead and, read at least this one to you. So the pandemic begins. The basic story of spring 2020 is agonizingly familiar. By March 16th, halfway into the semester, for some, a little bit further than halfway for others, every student, staff member, faculty member, and instructor had left campus, and every class had been moved abruptly online. I'll stop there. Some institutions, of course, were right at spring break, so they didn't get from a Friday to a Monday. They actually got a week, but other institutions, were just literally over the weekend doing this. Despite everyone's best efforts, faculty and students struggled as everyone confronted the uncertainties and dangers to life during a global pandemic. Anxiety, frustration mounted as lockdowns dragged on, while professional, academic, and domestic obligations persisted. Faculty had to simultaneously teach, adapt to unfamiliar teaching tools, advance research, and care for children whose schools had been closed. Students were faced with sudden returns to their homes, the cancellation of activities, and the seemingly impossibility of furthering research in labs and field sites. So just right there kind of says it all. And I don't know how many of you experienced these things from a variety of perspectives. I know, my former institution, I was talking to the instructional designers there, and of course they had become the most popular people on campus. They were also the most exhausted people on campus, and we're trying very hard to, to move people to that remote option. And this persisted for quite a while. And it felt like forever. Spring semester actually felt like forever, although it was just a little bit. Back to this campus I was working with, they were truly trying. They had, quite a few issues, and we learned a lot during that initial amount of time on how to use Zoom. We knew when it was summer, there were going to be quite a few professional development activities that were happening because we needed to get them into a learning management system. This institution wasn't giving a course shell to every course. So that was, one lesson, as well as all of the other logistics that happened as everybody grabbed their computers and went home. Some didn't have cameras, some had unstable internet. Students, same set of issues. This was a poor part of the state as well. So there were a lot of first generation students and minorities that were trying to continue to persist and take classes, but had very big issues. And, first set of purchases, like as I've talked to many institutions, was we've got to have more computers that we can check out. We've got to buy laptops. We've got to do all of those things. Not a lot of money yet because stimulus funding hadn't happened yet. All right, next slide. So we all remember this, right? So universities moving online, 90% of higher ed institutions use some form of emergency distance education to complete spring of 2020. And the rhetoric that comes later, right? Online learning is terrible. It was emergency distance education, not fully pedagogically designed courses. Next slide. So we know that it's different, and a majority of faculty who moved the courses online said they had never used this before across the country. So this was a national study. This was not a local study. In your institution, a UCF is going to have a different story than an institution that really wasn't focused, maybe a liberal arts college that wasn't focused on distance learning at all. But nationally, 56% of faculty had never taught online before. So there was a lot of conversation. There were a lot of things that had to be done to prepare people so they could get to the end of the semester. And what I was finding is people were using Zoom and not well, right? They hadn't learned the tools yet and what it could do and how to engage, how to interact. Students were, everything was just haywire. People were sending assignments and email and people were missing them and nobody was turning their cameras on. And, it was a little bit crazy at the very beginning, but everyone was in the swirl trying to do the best they could as people had to go home. And again, I'm thinking about this like you're telling a story. This never really happened, but it did. And I feel like, a lot of lessons were learned along the way. Okay, next slide, Vicki. So also happening, kind of concurrent to this, was many people quit their jobs. And we remember all the layoffs and so forth, but 4.2 million Americans quit their jobs. They walked away. And certainly when stimulus funding came, more walked away. And I want you to hold that thought because we're going to talk a little bit in a bit about short courses and, workforce demands and how universities can be a part of that. Okay, next slide. I hate it that I'm not able to do that. All right, so the other piece of the equation is that in the first month of the pandemic, courses, and I just use HarvardX here as an example, they went from 30,000 to 900,000 courses in that period of that month. They eventually stabilized, but this is while people were sitting at home like, hey, I want to learn how to bake bread, or hey, maybe I'll learn a little skill or whatever it was, but people were thirsting to do something with their time. And HarvardX, and Vicki, if you'll go on to the next slide, Coursera and edX also did the same thing. So edX, which we know has been bought out, but they still call themselves edX. 35 million students were turning to edX for short courses, stackable credentials, things that may lead to academic credit in the future. And students were doing it, and there were quite a few surveys that were done around that time to find out why they were participating in an edX. And it was to expand their resumes, to, figure out what they were going to do, just start thinking about the future a little bit. And people were starting to skill build in a different way. Now, this has been in place a long time, but not at this level of scale where we're seeing people doing this. One more slide on this topic. Coursera, same thing, grew 387%. So from 8 million users, which is already quite a few in 2019, to 31 million in 2020. And that eventually stabilized, and it's come back down a little bit. But that data point just shows where people were during that period of time. And although prior to the pandemic, we had all been talking about, micro credentials and MOOCs and short courses and a variety of different things, just kind of that cluster of short courses. But this is a demand signal that was starting to happen. Next slide. So here's year one. We remember with, not great memories probably, but just along the way, we were going up and down and up and down and up and down. And, in about May or June, we kind of thought we were good to go. We were going to have a regular fall semester. And so, things started to happen, and then, we already know the story, so no need to spend time on that. But as they went through, as institutions went through spring and summer, not as many people, obviously people online in the summer as well, by June and July, it was looking good. Next slide. And as we started reflecting in the summer, because people didn't breathe much in the summer. I mean, I don't even work full time anywhere anymore. And I was crazy busy. So I know at each of your institutions, you were crazy busy as well, doing professional development, trying to get people, because you could see at that point what people didn't know and what they really needed to just survive just a little bit longer, although we knew we were going back to campus in the fall. But nonetheless, a lot of professional development was happening all over the country. This is a reflection, and I'm not going into the video just because of the just choppiness of it sometimes online, but you have this, and the link to this is right below. And it is such an amazing video. I'd encourage you to really just listen in. It was a group of students, so just individual students were interviewed. It's about 3 minutes long, so it's not terrible. And each student was talking about what was important to them and the support that they received along the way during that time that they were in lockdown and kind of freaked out, and how their experiences obviously were different. They weren't on campus, they weren't in clubs, they weren't doing, they just weren't connected the way that they had been in the past. And these students primarily were traditional students. But what you'll hear is a key thread that was compassion and empathy and caring that the faculty maybe that's who they interviewed, but in every example, it was, my goodness, my professor really checked in on me and they wanted to know how I was doing. And that mattered to me more than anything else, because I no longer have this friend group. I no longer have this, we're just stuck here. And they appreciated that connection so much. And then they got to see the faculty as human. As when you're looking into someone's, on Zoom or whatever, when you're looking into someone's home, you're seeing, the baby cry or the dog jump or the cat do something stupid. And, and that might be this scholar house. And there was just a lot in this particular video, as well as in the research that's starting to emerge. This area of compassion and caring is something that Certainly there's professors that care. I don't mean to say that, but this was extra reaching out and coming together. And we saw the world do that. Sometimes people are at their best when the situations are at the worst. So, but just take a moment and take a look at that video, because we're at a point now where we want to call it the new normal, because by golly, everybody was going back to campus in the fall. But there were a lot of orders in place and things that we had to do. So next slide. So everybody's asking, are we there yet? And not so much. So next slide. So in fall 2020, I was working with a lot of presidents and leadership teams, and they were so wanting to have regular fall. They wanted students back on campus. They wanted things to just go back to normal, and not so much just for the passion, but there's also a little financing involved in that when people are in residence halls, when people are in dining and food services, and people are going to athletics. All of those things help support the full financial, piece of the institution. So we're pretending still. So next slide. And beginning to return to campus. So I'm not going to read this whole thing to you because you know where we are, but pivot, quarantine, mandates, ICE, and if you went through this, I sat on some teams that were, kind of the return to campus teams. And, we had to build a return to campus plan. Everybody in the country built a return to campus plan, required masks, temperature checks, check-ins. I mean, there were conversations like, okay, we only are going to open this door for people to go in and this door for people to go out because we don't want the hallways to be crowded. I mean, it was all the way down to that, and to the classrooms where people were going in and literally measuring, right, 6 feet apart, and how many people you can fit in a classroom, and how you're going to clean the desk. I mean, it was, I feel like, you look back now knowing what we know now, but this was people walking back into fear. And so they wanted to build, build the classrooms in such a way that people could come in and be comfortable, wear their mask, wash their hands, do all the safety things, while there's not enough classrooms ever to cut a class in half and still have enough space. So many institutions return to campus to create that safe environment. Also required, doing a variety of different things using technology, high flex, hybrid, blended learning. And so there was a lot of experimentation, but there was also a lot of best practice that was out there in the, certainly in the blended learning environment. Next slide. So we remember these phases, right? And it was just, we know how it went and the ups and downs and so forth along the way. Next slide. The reopening plans, kind of what I, talked about a little bit already, is students started moving in. I think I pulled this from an institution in Florida. I don't remember which one. Face masks, course delivery options, face-to-face with labs, distance learning, and hybrid courses. So in laboratories, you might recall, as you worked with your faculty on campus, anything that could be done virtually could, but they're going to tell you none of it could be, and really the students did need their hands on things as best as possible, but there are strategies. But they built schedules for labs so they could keep social distancing and not, use all the seats. You remember all that. And then they decided that no in-person classes will be held after Thanksgiving, no in-person, but that another opportunity for online learning, around assessments and so forth at the end of the semester. Next slide. Now, when we're talking about assessments, you might recall, and again, most institutions in Florida are good to go because there was protocols for assessment, for online assessment, ProctorU or whatever, whatever tools you're using to create that integrity of assessment, or tests had been already modified in many cases. And there are a lot of best practices and great examples for how to do assessment online. But many institutions, remember 56% had never done online before. They were now questioning, well, all the students must be cheating, things we've all heard before. But great plans, right? Colleges, pandemic pushed universities online. Sean Gallagher, if you follow him, I like most of his work, that the change was long overdue, which was great because it gave a lot of positive press to online learning along the way. And at that point, people hadn't really pushed back as much yet. Reopening plans, everybody best laid plans. In many cases, people pushed back their reopening a week or two for a variety of different reasons. Football in many cases was canceled. You remember all of that. Next slide. So there we are, kind of preparing for everything, and built in, our summer professional development initiatives. And I looked at a lot of institutions in Florida during this time, as well as institutions around the country, just to see what was going on. And there were some great events happening. There was some, obviously everything was online at that point, but some great events happening and very targeted professional development around STEM disciplines, around hybrid learning, blended learning, variety of different things, specific tools, because, in the event that faculty were going to need to continue recording video, or they were going to need to engage using a hybrid or high flex classroom. They really needed to know more than they did. And so a lot of great plans were put in place. Again, instructional design units were, campus heroes, but more and more exhausted along the way. Next slide. So the high flex classroom is something that I don't know if you can tell me how many of you did this. High flex. Did anybody do high flex? I think I saw somebody's hand. If you did high flex, you know where the hand is. Okay, cool. Yeah. So for some institutions that had classrooms in place with good audio, one key, video camera, another key, multiple cameras, even better. If you had classrooms that were like that already in place, those were good classrooms to participate, in high flex teaching and learning. And we have a lot of best practices around that and so forth. So, so in those classrooms, it made more sense. But at many institutions, using their federal dollars, purchased things that they could use to, put at their instructor stations to try to do this in the best way possible. And, audio was terrible in that sense. The camera was just, looking at the teacher, not the class. It was very difficult to do engagement, but a lot of strategies. And for those, like we had a distance learning classroom since the 90s at my institution, my prior institution. So in fact, we had a lot of strategies there, but many faculty really struggled with this. And it didn't matter what kind of professional development, but the conversations were emerging. Although we all know about flipped classrooms, and that's not a new thing for faculty, for many faculty, that was a new thing. So they started thinking about how might they flip the classroom? How might they do lectures, online or on video? And when students come to class, they're prepared to do activities and assignments, and they could break students out in Zoom, they could break students out in class. And so some really creative teaching, learning, feedback, assessment strategies really started to emerge when the faculty leaned in and embraced as best as possible that high flex experience. Next slide. Concurrent fall undergraduate enrollment, even then, was starting to drop. And so kids weren't coming back to school, and that was causing, financial concerns in addition to the, well, why aren't students coming back? Next slide. So now we're in year 2 and really settling in. We know what's going on. This year is about hybrid, proof of vaccination, getting the vaccination. People were tired of Zoom. People were tired of being online, where you had all these people. I should have got that data point on Coursera and learning all these things at the beginning. People were over it and sick of being online and just ready for what's, good things that are going to happen next. Schools and school districts started talking about just loss of learning and what's happening, in higher education. We had our own issues, but in K-12, a different set of issues where, there actually was a lot of documented loss of learning. Next slide. So are we there yet? Still not. Next slide. So now everyone's running on empty and trying to maintain civility and safety while being exhausted, but pushing on. During this period of time, there was also this study of the drop of males in higher education. Remember, in that first year, 4% didn't come back. In the second year, we lost 1 million learners. The majority of those learners were males. And you take it a step further, the majority of those were African-American males. And so, then the question started to pose, well, how do we get them back? That had been a trend for a long time, but it was significant during this period of time. People were now beginning to worry about economic competitiveness in the future and the quality of life, that people are having, and the fact that people aren't going to school, going to college. What is that going to mean for our future? Next slide. Equity, of course, was an issue. These were big times that students and faculty just, some things were happening that were horrible. A lot of conversations. I think people were just so tired of everything that was going on. But this was also a big transformative conversations that have been happening where institutions were, doing things in terms of changing, some were changing names, some were changing of buildings, some had to change the name of their institutions, and really rethinking what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like. What does equity look like if you look at it through a lens? And this was in the middle of the swirl of all these other things going on. Next slide. So fall 21, next slide. Everyone's running on empty, but hanging in there. And just, I pulled these from different conversations that I've had with people, as well as a report that I read, but I thought they were pretty good. Students were struggling, faculty are struggling to keep students' attention at this point. So this is in high flex universe, and students wanting to actually not come to class and be fully online sometimes because they had found out that was easier. People were using their phone for high flex and not engaging in the way. There's all kinds of craziness that were going on, people trying to make do, but faculty are exhausted and they're trying to balance what's synchronous, what's asynchronous, what the heck is going on, what am I trying to teach, am I achieving learning outcomes in this course a year into this, into this pandemic, or over a year. New modes of teaching were very difficult for many after decades of being face-to-face. Difficult, people played along, they did the best they could, but it was very difficult to navigate. And then some very positive people that looks like, the positive attitude allows you to think about these opportunities for the future and thoughtfully think about how teaching and learning can continue to happen. Next slide. And the students were still disappearing. Big deal for higher education overall. Next slide. 1 million fewer students are enrolled in the pandemic than before. So 1 million is such a large number. Enrollment declined at institutions across the country. Community colleges were hit the hardest. Many universities are still kind of in the ditch and not back to where they were before. Others have gotten back to where they were before. But what was happening at that point in time, it was like, oh, well, this is all the pandemic. If you look at the data, which I didn't pull in data slides, but if you look at the data, what you'll see is just simply saying it was the pandemic alone would be a cop-out. There are a lot of other things that are happening in that. Higher ed enrollments were declining overall across the country and will continue to decline over the next few years. So just one more little issue. Next slide. I think this is important because what this is talking about is even in the best case scenario, 1 million students down, if we address the enrollment issue, turn it around, just in the last 2 years, it's more than 1 million students who are not going to graduate. That means they're not going to get into the workforce. They're doing something different. They may become an adult learner eventually, but they never went to college. And when you don't go to college, people stop tracking you. So you don't even know, people don't even know where they went in many cases. Next slide. So cost and value is now becoming an issue. The value of the degree, what is it? Is it really good? Don't know what you've heard at your institutions, but we were hearing a lot of throughout this whole time, well, this online learning, thing, why are we paying as much for online learning as we did when you got to be on campus in the residence halls and participating in all these activities? And there was just a swirl of conversation around this. And many people around the world are starting to say, this higher ed's not working for me. It's not preparing me for a future, and it's getting too expensive. I'm walking away with too much debt. Next slide. And so now the college and skills, kind of balancing out, do I go to college? Do I just go directly to the workforce? Do I try to get some skills? What do I do? And there's all these conversations happening around the country. Next slide. So in swoops, things like Google Career Certificates, Amazon Web Services, all these different really cool certificates that people can get. Concurrently, what was happening, if we can't figure it out in higher ed, somebody else will swoop in and do it. What was also happening concurrently is because there was such a gap in the workforce, you couldn't get people to work. There are entire states around the country that have said, all right, well, you don't need a college degree anymore. We'll train you when you get here. It's not for all, all fields, but entire state governments were starting to do that. Tech companies are saying, nah, just come on in. We'll give you the certificate, go to a boot camp or take these 3 things along the way. And skills-based hiring was becoming a very strong thing. And so this is something that institutions, there's several groups around the country. There's a lab called the Ed Design Lab that has been working on this, and they were working on this before the pandemic, but really leaning into how might we, as higher ed, really lean into how we build skills-based certificates and so forth. Colleges have that figured out. They've done that for years. Universities in a different place haven't really thought about that as frequently. Next slide. And the other thing that was happening or is happening is the enrollment cliff. So I've been hearing about this since, forever, that that birth rate was going to decline and there would be fewer kids going to college. Well, guess what? It's true. And in 2025, every state's a little bit different, but between 2025 and 2027, there's going to be a steep decline of traditional age students. And it talks about being 400,000 fewer students in a span of 4 years. So about 100,000 students a year, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's different in different states. So some it'll be a small impact in other states, in other parts of the country where, birth rate from the 2008 recession caused this decline. We're going to be feeling this for a long time. So enrollment in college, the financial issues, et cetera. Next slide. So we're still not there yet. Next slide. So the other thing on the horizon is, of course, we've been getting federal stimulus dollars for many years. Well, that's, at the end. And financial, CFOs and finance and administration leaders around the country are now asking, what's going to happen when that goes away? Are we going to be able to balance enrollment with the lack of federal resources? And the resources were targeted to very specific things, but enrollment plays a key role in the full financial picture of institutions. Next slide. So all of that's going on, and I probably should have put it as a swirl instead of a timeline because it's crazy. In the meanwhile, online learning continues to be a very strong piece of institutional strategy, and all of us followed that. The reports of online learning that were happening every year, where we would see online learning grow, and then it was starting to plateau a little bit prior to the pandemic. And we were also seeing, or at least what I was always looking at, one of those questions, the study that was from Babson College, one of those questions was focused on, is it part of institutional strategy? And in fact, it was part of institutional strategy prior to the pandemic, but now it is even more a part of the institutional strategy because we know it's here to stay. So Vicki, I did have a few more slides, just kind of the lessons learned. Do we think we could get to those?
I think yes, you have 20 minutes left, so you're good. Or about,
okay, but
about 10 minutes. Yeah, if we want questions, about 10 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I'm not seeing, maybe I don't see you anymore. I don't know what happened. Let's see. There we go. I was seeing my own Zoom slides and it was back at the beginning. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's a subtle hint for I'm done. All right, so now we're putting the pieces back together, and there's a lot of conversation. People haven't had time to breathe in so long. And so now there's reports that are starting to come out that are taking a pause and really looking back over the last 3 years to figure out what we carry forward, and that we don't want to put the pieces back together exactly to look like what it was before, because we've learned some things. We've learned new things. We, certainly as designers, some new tricks, some new tools, some new things to really create student engagement. But faculty have also learned things, and they've learned how really they could deliver some specific things online. I'm going to give you an example. I worked with a culinary school, which was super fun during the pandemic, and literally touch and, all of the senses, right? The smell, the touch, just seeing things as a pot of soup is boiling or something is braising or whatever, with these super fancy teaching kitchens, was not something that could be replicated during the pandemic. But they were very creative and came up with this strategy of using, and they had a teaching video classroom. So they did a lot of that in there, but somehow their cameras weren't quite set up right to really get the views that they were trying to get from all of their different, their baking kitchen and their bread making kitchen and their braising state, all those different areas. So faculty actually put the GoPro cameras, they attached it somehow to their chef hats, so that they were trying to get so students that were watching remotely could see what they were seeing. And what happened as a result of that, it became a very good teaching strategy that they continue to use some of those videos along the way. We're seeing the same thing in the STEM disciplines. I had faculty that I worked with that talked about, their like a biology lab or a chemistry lab where, there's just chemicals in there that you can't do a to-go kit with some chemicals. Some things you could do, take it home kind of kits, but there's some things that are super dangerous that that you have to really practice that safety in a laboratory. And so the creativity that came out of that was, one, they really studied, observational learning, right? I kept telling them, I swear there's a body of research on observational learning that says it works. You watch YouTube videos all the time. You can then go fix the motor on your car. I know it'll work. And so they would go in and they would do the different pieces of the lab experiments, and they would talk about it and demonstrate. So there was a lot of demonstrations. They're still using those videos. But one super creative faculty said, all right, well, I'm going to do the labs, but I'm going to have the students do the lab reports. So they just have to be a part of that lab, and that's their way to engage. So these kind of conversations, these kind of questions that were happening early on are now things that are moving into that future of higher education with pedagogy that is changing. We have more tools now. During the funding, where institutions were able to buy more technology and buy more things, faculty had to really lean in and learn how to use it. And so I'm seeing engagement in the classroom starting to strengthen. Blended learning is something that, institutions that have been doing blended learning for a long time. And I know UCF is on, and, I'm still remembering the blended learning toolkit that you did many years ago, and the test and the studies and so forth. And we knew it was going to be a strategy. But now other institutions are listening and have realized, yeah, that really is a pretty good strategy. Next slide. So lessons learned that we have along the way. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That's a whole story in itself, right, with teaching math. So here we are today, and we know that online learning works. Design units are rock stars that are exhausted. I have some friends that are instructional designers that are retiring this year. And I was trying to get them to come work on some other projects that I had. I'm like, hey, you could come design here. They're like, no, really, I need a year off. And they don't even want to be in front of a computer. I think one of them wants to go, dig in the dirt or something, just does not want to do anything online. So exhausted. But with great pride, I'm very proud that instructional designers all over the state of Florida and around the country have gotten, really some incredible recognition around pedagogy and practice and support for faculty, that I think that's forever changed. And I think, it'll evolve, and obviously it's settled down a little bit now, but I do think it gives us opportunities for the future to continue to push forward into teaching and learning and pedagogy, and really having those deeper conversations with faculty as the future. Students persisted. I didn't pull data up on this, but students persisted to graduation. New students didn't come in, but students persisted. That's cool. There was continuity of instruction because we had emergency remote and we had pedagogically sound online learning. Next slide. What many faculty have talked about is that simultaneous multi-person interaction and how great that is for students. So kind of it created that peer-to-peer learning, which you kind of simulate, when you think about building online courses, right? It's, student to student, student to instructor, student to content, that kind of old literature now, but around that. But what was found by using Zoom, once people really got into it, or whatever tool, Teams or, whatever, is that you really could be more interactive online. You can use chat on Zoom, so you've got this simultaneous stuff going on. You can do breakout rooms, which is super cool, bring back together. You can vote, you can poll, you can do all of those things to engage students. Also discovered, which again, Google Docs is nothing new, but also discovered that using Google Docs, there was a lot of ways to engage, whether it's with a course where you put everyone in Google Docs or whatever. It also bridges space that opens up the world. So it allows for, and again, we know this, but in practice, now more people know this, that people were bringing in remote guest experts, like no kidding experts, to have conversations with their students. There were things that were open all over the world and free that people could get into from tools and libraries and research. And following Nat Geo did a lot of expeditions during this time, and the scientists were really following that along the way. Next slide. And I am almost finished, so give us a little time. Personalized learning also became a thing, and it's a game changer. Learning how to flip the classroom, learning how to use digital tools. Remember, 56% weren't using online learning. They weren't getting course shells. They weren't doing grading. They weren't doing any of that stuff online. So they just weren't doing all of that. And then combining digital tools to engage in a classroom, whether it's face-to-face or online. Next slide. And then blended learning is predicted to be a strong strategy for the future. We could have probably told people that, but now people have experienced. Outcomes were great. Faculty can see positive opportunities for agility and flexibility that's needed for a variety of things. Next slide. And so both technology and pedagogy matter. Content and community are vital, and we must seek new paths to excellence with inclusion. Next slide. New kinds of degrees are emerging, short courses are emerging, micro-credentials and so forth, just those small pieces of instruction that many institutions are now saying, hey, I could do this, I could connect it to a program, student's going to walk away with a degree and an industry-based certification or this skill in this. And there's opportunities to bring people back to school or just to continue their education lifelong, but it also provides opportunities to learn at scale. And I wish I had more time to talk about that. Next slide. So the pandemic has increased a sense of urgency. Priorities have shifted, and looking at these options for students on how they can accelerate their time to completion is more important than it has ever been before, because we want to get them in, get them through, get them out, help them to be successful along the way so that we can launch them into great careers, because that is what people care about. Or many people, great careers, great grad school, wherever it is that they're going, but help launch them into their next step. Next slide. I believe this is it. So, Terry Hartle, who is Senior Vice President of ACE, basically indicated it's going to take several years for us to figure this all out. It'll be 4 or 5 years before we can really sort out what's happened. But it's been a ride, to say the least. I think it has accelerated opportunities for using digital tools to support teaching and learning. And, we've always had those that have wanted to participate in that faculty-wise, but now others that maybe weren't in those early adopters and those that were in the crew that always come to professional development are now leaning in and asking those questions because they've gotten, they've learned a little bit. All right, last slide, I guess. I mean, it's, are we there yet, I guess. So I know we're getting close to the end of time, but let me open it up if there's any questions or anything that anyone has on their mind.
It's okay, you can unmute now. If you have questions for Dr. Northrup.
I certainly do enjoy using the chat, the breakout rooms when I'm working with collaborative groups with students. I especially like it in Google Meets because it allows you to do the God mode, so you can actually listen in and see what they're listening in. And while in Zoom, you don't have that ability. You have to literally represent yourself, and of course they change up who they are. But in Google Meets, that little anonymity is kind of very cool and very refreshing.
Well, and it's just, I mean, if you teach in the classroom, it's almost like that walking around and sort of listening in on a group, but not really participating, right? So it gives you that. I guess you would have an invisibility cloak on or something, but still, no, I like that. Okay. Anyone else have questions or comments or anything? I know this was fast. And when Vicki, contacted me, I'm like, holy cow, I'm going to talk about the whole pandemic. But it's, but it actually, interestingly, if anyone's looking for research, there is just not much out there yet. I think people just like, let's not talk about that stuff because we're trying to move on. But that reflection and figuring out, pull the threads through, what worked really great and go full throttle on that, because I think, it's been enough time that people aren't so sick of being in front of their computer. But it's, but as you're planning for your next year and the next year, how might you, build online courses and blended courses in a way that really engages students. And that's always what we're trying to think through, right? So.
I do think we're a little confused on our campuses still because the students appear to not be wanting to come back on campus, and not because they're afraid of viruses. They've just found that it's so convenient to take the courses online. And so then you're, how do we create this new normal, and what is that balance of blended and online learning? So I think we're still struggling here, even though we've been back on campus for a year. Where are we going to, how are we going to balance all of those things?
And I think, yeah, boy, that's not a 2-minute answer, right? But I think, I think it's really leaning in, and I think, senior administrators and people on campus that are building their strategy for the future really need to lean in and have that conversation. Do you want students on campus? How might you get them here? How might you balance blended with online? It's, and then you've got students that just don't want anything to do with all that online, so you've got both. And then, as that traditional student declines and more non-traditional students are part of the academy, you've got to, recognize they're busy, they work, they're not going to, join a fraternity, they're busy. And so, so it is balancing our dreams of the past with the reality that's before us.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of also the conversations we had about building space at the state level. And, if we're having more blended classrooms, then do we need that many classrooms? There's just a whole ton of questions that can really come.
Yeah, sure can. Well,
thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this really high level view of what happened through the pandemic. I think sometimes it's helpful to know what's going on in our administrative offices, and even though we may be faculty or instructional designers, sometimes we don't quite understand what's happening to us, and having that high level view is very helpful. So we are really excited. The next session, the next part of the program today is to have our breakout sessions. So it looks like we have some fantastic ones. So please go ahead and join the rooms for the next sessions that you might be interested in. Looking forward to seeing you later. We have our technology panel today and also our higher ed panel. If you want to have a conversation with me, I'll be ready to have a great time with you in a little while. So make sure you check in, and we can have a great conversation about FDLA, where it's going to go, and what can we do to make our research and best practices better known across the United States. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.